everyone, and welcome back. I often get questions about how to go about carving your own last or your own wooden heels. Now, last making itself is an incredibly complex process, and I am still learning a lot about it. So instead, we're going to start with looking at heels. Heels historically were most commonly done with wood. There are definitely stacked leather heels, but they tended to be these shorter styles. So all of those curved heels that you see throughout the 17th, 18th, 19th, and even into the 20th centuries were all wooden heels that were then covered often with leather or fabric. So there are multitudes of shapes that you can go with, but they all tended to be a wooden base. Now, when it comes to understanding what shape you're going for in what era, it can be incredibly complex because most of the time museums have very few pictures of the shoes that they have in their collections. Advertisements, same thing. You aren't seeing every angle that you need. So the way that I tend to study for a heel, understanding how to design it, is to start off researching that era, figure out, pinpoint what styles I want to look for from those few years around that era, and then I will take that knowledge from single angles and go over to places like Etsy or eBay, where usually sellers have lots of pictures of these shoes that they're selling, and there are quite a few sad shoes that are really inexpensive and can be great study pieces because they can't do anything else with them. So I tend to get study pieces from those places, look at lots of images, and that gives me a much better three-dimensional idea of what I'm trying to accomplish. From there, the design process can actually begin. You do need a last for this part of the process. It can be a modern last because honestly, even with a modern last, a historic heel really brings out the look of a historic shoe very, very quickly. The heel makes such a big difference. So what I'm going to do is take you through the process today of designing from scratch with just your last, the type of heel that you want to make based off of images or even based off of an original shoe. I'm also going to show that process of literally copying off a heel off of a shoe without having to actually damage or hurt the shoe in any way, so that way we can match it up to a last that already exists. From there, once we have the design, it's time to move into the actual construction process. I have a tendency to use poplar wood. Most of the time it's sold as rainbow poplar, tulip poplar, or yellow poplar, and this is a hardness scale of around 540. I would not go softer than this. I could definitely go a lot harder, and I have gone up to birchwood before, which is, I believe, around 1260, and I found that really difficult to work with as I that time was working with a lot more hand tools. Could probably manage it now with some of the more power tools that I use, but anywhere in that range is good. The key factor is just to use a wood that is very linear in its grain. It doesn't have knots and burls and inclusions, things that could potentially be a problem with where you're placing your heel to be carved out. So you just want something that is very consistent in that way, and that's why I've had luck with both birch and poplar for that reason. I tend to purchase those in a 3x3, which is, I believe, about 7.5 by 7.5 centimeters with whatever length they are, because usually the heels that you are making will be somewhere in that range height-wise and width-wise. I have tried working with a 2x2 before, and usually it's just a little too small for the vast majority of heels and the vast majority of feet. So 3x3 is really the ideal amount in terms of your overall size. From there are lots of tools that you can use for this. I tend to use Japanese saws. I will show you the ones that I use later. You can also use bandsaws or other power tools. You just have to make sure that something like a bandsaw can go up to 3 inches and more, and that can actually handle the wood that you're putting through it. I killed a bandsaw making heels once because it barely made it up to 3 inches, and it did not like the birch wood once I got it up to that point. So it really does require a pretty hefty piece of machinery for you to do that. So I tend to stick with hand saws and a really good vise mounted very well to a work table. That's a key factor. Good vise that can go up to 3 inches or more and can be mounted very securely with whatever surface you need it on, because if it's moving around, it's going to make your process of sawing a lot more difficult. So definitely get a good vise. The saws are pretty inexpensive and really useful for a lot of different things. And then when it comes to the actual process of taking it from a rather blocky, chunky piece to a soft, smooth, curved piece, that's where you want to get into some sort of power tool for sanding. I have a occipital sander that actually rotates around. It's curved and has different circumferences, so I can get into different areas of the heel. And I love this piece, but yeah, it's a little bit big, it's a little bit awkward, you really need to hook it up to a shop vac, so it's not for everybody. If you don't want to go that route, get a really good Dremel, because Dremels are useful for just about everything, like so many crafting bases, and you just have to get the right type of tip for it, for the purpose that you're doing. You'll want something that is, again, a tube-shaped sander. You'll want to get something that has a more rounded tip for certain areas of the shoes. So just figure out what types of bits are going to work best for the types of heels you're doing and what process you want to go through. But definitely do that. I used to carve things out by hand using a knife and essentially whittling away a pair of heels. Do not recommend. Did that for many years, ended up exhausted and sore with lots of blisters. I am a fairly strong person when it comes to doing this sort of stuff because I've done shoemaking and lots of other things for years. So I don't recommend doing it that way. It's painful, difficult, and time-consuming. I used to take a few days to make a pair of heels, taking breaks in between for my hands, and now I can make a couple pairs in a day easily. Not a problem, with just honestly no effort. So I do recommend a Dremel or some sort of other power-based sander that has curve to it. You can't really work on a flatbed nearly as easily. From there are a few other tools that I tend to use in order to sort of finesse and nuance the edges and the curves and the concave sections. I'll show you those as well, but that's really the main bulk of what you need, and hopefully all of those tools will be useful for lots of other things as well. So that's what we're going to get into today, the entire process of carving these out, so that way you can take your shoemaking to the next level and maybe even take a pair of modern shoes and remake them in a much more historical way. This really just takes such a big effect on the look of a shoe, much more than the shape of your last, to be honest. So historic heels is the best place to start if you are looking to start customizing your process. The first step in figuring out a new heel is to get the bottom line of the last. It's important to know how this needs to sit based on the ground. The toe spring in front can only be so much. It can only go down so far and up so far, so your heel height has a range in which it can sit based off of your last. You don't want your toe spring to be more than a couple centimeters off the ground. Honestly, even 1.5 is pretty high, and the point obviously can't be lower down than the ball of your foot. So we're drawing out that curve just by tracing it off of the last. If you want to be more precise, there are different tools that you can use for that. This particular tool has been incredibly useful in my carving of lasts and heels because I can make sure that they are precisely identical to each other. I'm just double checking the trace line that I took off of the last, which actually ended up being almost exactly the same, so it's not necessary by any means to have that exact tool for this. It can just help things a little bit. Again, I'm double checking the heel height, which comes in at 5 centimeters, and the toe spring, which is coming in at 1.5 centimeters. I'd like the toe spring to be closer to 1, and the heel height at 5.5 seems about what I was looking for. So I'm going to adjust that bottom straight line, so that way it matches up with the toe spring and the heel height that I want, making sure that it meets up with the bottom point of the last. Now the toe spring is a little bit over 1 centimeter and the heel height is 5.5. And yes, I do all of my shoemaking in metric. I'm also going to double check the back curve of the last and go ahead and trace that out. Again, you can trace this off of the last or use a tool for that. The reason why you need that curve is because that curve will tell you the continuation of how the heel needs to sit. Unlike modern heels, we aren't looking for this to jut out of the back awkwardly. We want it to be a nice, smooth curve off the center back of your last. Next, we have to figure out where the base of the heel should sit. This needs to be comfortably under your foot. You can use another shoe that has a heel that you really like, that might be similar height or similar shape of heel, to figure out about where this needs to sit under your heel. You'll know if it's wrong because it will feel incredibly uncomfortable, but I really do recommend checking this either by way of your foot or by a shoe that has a similar heel. I center up where that needs to be, and then I space out about how big I want the base of my heel centered over that point, and then I can start drawing the curves up to match the back and around to the front. Some shoes have a straight, what's called heel breast in the front. Others have a curve that continues sort of underneath the arch of the foot slightly. This particular style has a very graceful, smooth curve to it that comes up off the arch of the shoe. In order to figure out the center back profile, I'm going to draw a parallel line across from the highest point of the heel and then draw a vertical line perpendicular to that. You need to check the width of the last now. You're also going to need the actual shape of this for the heel, so we're going to go ahead and trace around. If it's a high-heeled shoe, you'll need to either hang it off the table like I'm doing here, so that way you can actually get the heel portion flat to the paper, or bring the paper up and around the last, whatever way you find easiest to get that shape precisely. I'm then double checking it with calipers. Calipers I do heavily recommend when it comes to shoemaking. That's a tool that's pretty inexpensive and easy to find and really, really useful. So I'm just correcting the tracing that I made, making sure that it is to the millimeter correct, and I'm going to take that same width and apply it to the top portion of my center back view of the heel. That is the widest point of the top of our heel. Now we can double check the bottom part. You don't have to have the same width and length of the base of your heel. Sometimes they're dramatically different, but for this particular style, it is generally pretty close to being the same. There are some eras that are very narrow and long and extend under the foot. I haven't come across very many that are wider than they are long underneath the foot, but it's possible. We're then going to double check where the narrowest point of that heel is if you're doing a curved French heel or Louis heel, and mark out that same height, and then you can draw up to the narrowest point, sort of bringing in that arch, and then back out again from that narrowest point. This helps you define exactly where that curve should start and stop. I'm also at this point double checking the curve of my last from the side. That's kind of hard to trace out from the last, but it's something, if you do have this tool, that does make it much easier. Otherwise, you can just sort of eyeball roughly. It doesn't have to be precise, and you can adjust it in the making, but it helps to know what will continue that line and not jut out or jut in. Next, we're going to find out how long the top of this heel needs to be. And yes, it is on an angle, and that is what we are going for. We're going to be tracing this onto the block of wood, which will already have the angle cut, so we need to know exactly how long this top view should be to be correct. Eventually, this will have a little bit of a curve to it, but for right now, just make sure you center it up. If you can use a quilting rule or some sort of other clear rule to make sure you aren't going off kilter, that you're centering it up, it looks nice and symmetrical and even down where you're drawing that line, and that will give us a place to actually cut into our block of wood. The final view is the base. Just like the top view, we need a view of what the bottom of the shoe is going to look like. I start off by drawing an X, so that way I have two straight lines that are perpendicular to each other, and then I'm going to double check those length and width markings based off of the side view and back view that I drew, because it has to match up with those precisely. Make sure they're centered up. If you need to measure this, that's perfectly fine. It's small enough for me that I'm pretty good at eyeballing that. The front section where the heel breast will match up, we're just going to draw a straight line, and then draw a straight line back to those two width markings for the front half, and the back half will get curved. Now, the type of curve we're doing here is usually just a fairly soft, honestly, almost perfect circle curve. Sometimes it is much more pronounced and square, other times it almost comes to a point. The 1890s really liked very narrow but long and honestly somewhat pointed, almost like a shield shape bases. So there's a variety of different shapes on the bottom of heels depending on the era. I'm also drawing in a little curve at the front of the heel breast that I will at the very end deal with. This is again a trademark of the era that I'm looking at, but is fairly common through a lot of different time periods, to be honest. In order to either copy off a heel from an original shoe, or if you're going to replace the heel on a shoe to know what size and angle and all of that you need to be basing your new heel on, we're going to start by tracing out the heel itself. Again, you can do this with a tool, or you can do this off of the actual shoe. You just have to spend a little bit more time making sure that you're getting your pencil straight up and down. It's a little complex, but you can double check the widths of those things with calipers. I'm also making sure to mark out where the heel cap sits and how thick that is, because that won't be included in the wooden heel that we're carving, and we want to make sure that we account for that. I am going ahead and tracing out the front line, since in this case it is just a straight front line, and figuring out where the height sits. That gives us the angle and the way it matches up with the angle of the shoe. Since I'm going to be doing this on my last, I'm not going to trace out the entire base of that shoe, but I am going to mark where the bottom of it falls, so that way I can kind of see what angle the heel should be at, what angle the last should be at, based off of the height of that heel. Since I've already traced out my last ones, I'm not going to try and do it one more time. I'm just literally going to trace onto the paper, making sure that the base of that last hits just above that line, since, like I said, we are dealing with a sole that is already attached to this one shoe, so I want to make sure that I account for a little bit of space in that particular region. And you'll notice the toe spring, using it this way, is much higher because this heel is a little bit shorter than the version that I just did. But that's okay because the toe spring of the actual boot is really high, so it actually matches up correctly. I wouldn't normally put a toe spring this high, but that's the way the original boot is. And just like we did before, we're going to mark across the bottom and the top of the back view of the heel, so that way we're sure it is exactly the same height. And then we can start coming up with the widths. The bottom width, I double checked on the original with calipers because the heel cap is actually flared out a fair bit from wearing, so it's hard to measure by tracing it. So I used calipers to double check that measurement and then drew up a straight perpendicular line to make sure that it was centered on that measurement that I took off the bottom. The top measurement will once again be based off of my last. If you are basing it on a shoe that you are trying to replace the heel on, then you need to measure what the top of the actual heel is. At this point, it might be easier to remove one of the heels, at least from the shoe, and be able to trace out the top of that heel. But in my case, since I'm working off of last, I just need to mark out what the widest point is at the top, like before, and I'm going to go ahead and draw straight lines down from top to bottom, even though there's a slight curve on this shoe. But I'm going to start off with those straight lines because it is such a slight curve. There's not any reason for me to try and go through complicated measures to figure it out. I'll just redraw a slight curve next to the straight line, and when I'm actually working on carving out the heel, I'll make sure to put a little bit of curve in that area. Again, double checking the length of the top line there and applying it to that tracing from the last, just like we did before. It will be a little bit shorter this time because this heel has a straight heel breast and doesn't curve out and under, so the size overall will be much shorter. For the base of the heel cap was flared out. It had been worn quite a bit and had mushed out towards the bottom. So what I'm doing is getting the general shape off of this tracing, and then I will use my calipers to go and measure out what it actually should be at those points and apply it evenly. Now, this heel cap does have a concave curve at the front, so I'm going to go ahead and draw a straight line so that way I know I'm measuring to that widest point, not to the narrow point where it's curved in, because that wasn't how I measured with my calipers. So I'm only off by about 2 millimeters, 1 millimeter each side. Same thing with width, double check it there, a little bit closer. Not surprisingly, walking kind of pushed out the back more so than the sides. And I'll redraw that curve following the original curve and just matching up with the new points that I drew to make sure my widths were precise. And we have our final heels. Next, we're going to start applying them to a block of wood. You have to make sure to follow the grain here. You need the grain running the length of the heel, and I tend to use the flat, clean side of one of the blocks for the bottom of my heel. That, I don't want it to be at an angle, I don't want it to be uneven, that's what's going to hit the ground. I need it to be as even and smooth as possible. So the first one gets drawn there, and the second one you can angle in really close to it depending on what sort of tool you have to cut these apart. You might need a good 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch separation between the two pieces, or you might be able to get a very close cut. I know I can get a close cut based off of the tools I have and my experience, so I don't leave a lot of space. But you might need to be able to do a straight line between the two. So keep that in mind as you are tracing these two out on the block of wood. I'm then going to mark on the next side where the bottom hits and make sure I'm taking a perpendicular line across, draw the next line, making sure that they are staying nice and square to each other, and that will help us draw out on the other side the exact same tracings. We want to make sure those line up because it's really hard when you're sawing through something unless you have a power tool that allows you to make sure that you are completely vertical the whole time and everything is at the correct angle. You're going to want to make sure that you have both the front and back drawn out so you are not sawing at an angle that ends up with a smaller piece on one side than the other. This block of wood is much wider than I need it to be, and we will cut that down later, so there's a little bit of room for error just in case one side ends up being really perfect and the other side's a little off. There is some space for adjustment, but drawing all of these lines around all of the sides, making sure everything is lined up, everything is square, and you know no matter which angle you're looking at the block from, exactly where you were supposed to cut is really important. The tools that I tend to use are Japanese saws. They're very thin and easy to deal with. This one's my longer one. I don't use it on heels as much as I use it on lasts. And I have a shorter one which is slightly less flexible that I use for all of my smaller cuts and is pretty much what I use on heels all the time. It has two different sides depending on the type of harshness of cut that you need to be making. And then the last tool that I recently added to my arsenal is this saw, which is very, very thin and narrow and is meant to deal with cutting out curves. So that's how I'm able to get the two heels placed together so tightly. I have a space in my garage with a clamp, and I saw away different sections one at a time. I usually start with sawing away the heel breasts, because those just can be little square pieces. If I have extra at one end, I'll take that away. You'll notice that I'm not cutting right up against the lines. I'd like to give myself a little bit of space just in case I'm off with the angle of the saw, and that's really easy for me to adjust with sanding later. I'm going to then take away the angles from the tops, so that way I have more access to the angle in between the two. Makes it a little bit simpler. And then I will take that final cut with my very narrow saw, which you, again, might need way more space for, because I'm able to put a little bit of curve into mine. And that's how I get them separated into the final two pieces. The next thing we're going to do is cut down that width. Again, like I said, we were leaving that portion until this step, just in case we messed up one side or the other. If we were a little bit off with the angle of our saw, it's okay. You choose the better side. I like to go ahead and mark out that same width the whole way around, just like we had done for the very first step, making sure that I know exactly where I am cutting to, where the maximum point is the whole way around. Yes, the bottom of the heel will be narrower, so it's okay if I go past that at the bottom, but this gives me a good reference point. It also allows me to draw a middle line the whole way around, and I cannot emphasize how important this step is, no matter what sort of tools you're using, what sort of process you're using. Make sure you mark out that middle line the whole way around, and you keep updating it as you cut off or sand off different sections. This is the way that you're going to make sure it does not end up skewed and asymmetrical, which is really important. I'm then marking the curve of the back, which won't be precise because it's now at an angle and the drawing that I made is from a direct center back view, but I have a pretty good idea about how narrow it needs to be then. That just helps me double check before I go in and start sawing down, just in case I am going at an angle. I'm sure that the angle is okay. Now we have a pretty good start on the shape. If you wanted to, you could go ahead and start sanding from here, depending on what sort of tool you have. If you don't have a good sander for this, if you're going to be working with knives, if you're going to be putting a lot more hand effort into it, I would definitely recommend going ahead and cutting off those little excess bits at the back where it angles around. I tend to go down, and then once I hit that midway point where it's at its narrowest, go up from the bottom if it is one of these French curve styles. If it's straight down, I can just go the whole way down. The very first sanding that I'm going to do is on the sides and the back. This is because I have those silhouettes drawn out and I can trace them onto the block of wood and make sure that I am matching up to those checkpoints. I'm not dealing with curves yet, we're just trying to get the back angle and side angles correct. From there, I can get more precise with my sanding. I tend to work back and forth different directions. I will work vertically to get rid of that strong angle along the sides, and then I might start working horizontally to curve that out more. If I'm dealing with a French heel, I make sure that I'm matching up the size of the sander that I'm currently using to that curve, so that way it's not too big or too small. Work back and forth, different directions, different angles to see what works for you, what works for that heel shape, what works for that wood hardness. There's no one right way to do this, and as you see, I just kind of move back and forth. Sometimes it's long strokes, sometimes it's really short sections, and we end up with a really nice smooth curve fairly quickly from this once you get used to the movements you need to do. Again, I've remarked that center line, so that way I'm sure it is still present and helping guide me. Next, I need to get rid of the extra that is at that front section and double check the height of the heel. I left a little bit of extra when I was sawing, so there's inevitably going to be some extra there. When it comes to the front heel breast, I will change out the size of the sander that I'm using. This particular heel is the 1920s heel, so I don't have to curve out the heel breast, but I am curving out that vertical section. So I chose my widest setting for that, so that way that was as close as possible. But for the French heel, I had to go with a smaller circumference for the sander in order to carve in really well. Now, as you might realize, if I'm going to be putting in that curve there on the heel, I can't really do that on the sander. That's really hard to get in there, so I will actually do that with a knife. The other thing that's really hard to do on the sander is to carve out the top of your heel. It needs to match the curve of your last, or actually be slightly more curved, because the insole that is there is actually going to be thicker in the middle than on the side, so you'll need a little bit more curve than your last actually has. I use 3 different tools for this process, depending on what works best for you. I have a wood carving knife that is pointed and small. I have a push carver, which is very sharp when you get these. Fair warning, I took a chunk out of my leg the first time I used this. And then I also have a spoon carving knife. It just depends on whether you are more comfortable pulling towards you, pushing away from you, holding the piece against a table, or in your hand. I've used all 3 of these in different capacities, and I very often will use all 3 on one shoe just to get the right curve, depending on the heel and how easy it is to hold. For the push tool, which tends to be my favorite at this point, I like to brace it up against a table. As I said, this can be a very sharp tool, and I will leave permanent marks in this self-healing mat, but it's way better than me leaving permanent marks anywhere else. So I'm just working at carving out long lines, trying to get pretty close to the edge, but not exactly at the edge. It's not a perfect edge yet. There's a little bit of extra that I'm going to have to carve away as I start matching it to the last. It allows me to carve out as much as I think I need, and then double check it on the last. You can see there's still a pretty big gap around the edges. It's hitting at the front heel breast and it's hitting at the back heel, and it's not hitting in between. So I need to bring down the little swoop at the back that I had left just in case. I'm going to carve that down either by way of sander or by way of knife, and then go back in and carve out the heel cup just a little bit further. See, we're much closer now. There's still a little bit of gapping in a few areas. There's definitely less of an issue around the edge, and there's something inside. There's something in the heel cup that is preventing it from sitting flush around the edges. And it's really hard to tell where that is. So my method for this is if you either have colored chalk, or best yet, if you have those paper chalk things that you use with the wheels in order to mark out darts and things on your sewing. I love placing that in between the two and pressing down really hard, scooting it around a little bit, and the markings will transfer onto your heel cup. And you will know where they are hitting each other. So then I'll go back in, carve out the sections that ended up blue, double check again, repeat, repeat, repeat until it sits correctly. I could have definitely used a chalk that was a little more obvious, but this actually ended up being the most colorful chalk that I had in my arsenal at the moment. So that's what we're going with. Again, just double checking where it is hitting and carving out those sections over and over again until it is flush and correct. Then I will go in, make sure everything is set correctly between the heel and the last, and draw out where I need to cut the heel back to. It's at this point that I will get right up against that edge and make sure that I end up carving out right up to that edge. I don't want a thick line horizontally around that exterior. That's going to be obvious and stick out from the shoe in its final form. It needs to be very sharp and very pointed along that edge. But that's easy to do right before I cut it, and then I can cut down directly to that angle. It's so much easier to angle it in and then cut up to the edge. Trust me on this. The final step you're going to have to do is to make sure that once you have the heel cup correct, and you have that front heel breast curved correctly, that they match up, meaning that when you look at the sides, you don't want those angles to meet up and then have a flat end. You need to have them come to a nice point. Don't adjust the top edge, only adjust the heel breast to match up with where your top edge needs to be. So yes, your heel breast will get slightly curved at the top, that's fine. It's also common that you will find that from the top view that front edge is concave, and honestly I find it more comfortable because it doesn't seem to cut into the arch of my foot quite as much as when it is straight across. The final things that you'll want to double check with your heel is to make sure that it does completely match up with that last, that it sits stable, it doesn't wobble back and forth, it doesn't sit at an angle off the ground. If the bottom of your heel is not sitting completely flat, you will need to adjust the overall angle of your top edge. It's really important to make sure that nothing's at an uncomfortable angle or wobbly.